Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
Hello, Stephen Carroll from the Bloomberg UK Politics team here. We wanted to bring you an episode of another Bloomberg podcast today, Voternomics with Allegra Stratton, Alva Ray and Alex Wickham. Hope you enjoy. We'll be back in your feeds on Monday.
Welcome to Voternomics, where politics and markets collide. This year, voters around the world have the ability to affect markets, countries and economies like never before. So we've created this series to help you make sense of it all. I'm Allegra Stratton, and this week we actually don't have the usual Voternomics crew. Stephanie's in Barcelona and Adrian's in New York, but instead we've got two of Bloomberg's top UK reporters right here in the studio with us to join us for this episode. Alex Wickham, Westminster political editor, and Alva Ray, reporter and fellow Readout newsletter writer. We are a month in, guys, to this election. How are you bearing up?
Probably better than most of our sources, who all seem to be on their last legs. I'm not sure how we're going to do another 9 days, but not long now.
Is that all parties or
all parties? I think it's just so hard on a campaign, isn't it? It's one thing being journalists, go on a bus, late nights, but if you're an advisor or candidate, you're just absolutely constant. There's no escape.
If I think back to the battle buses that I was on, I can think of the moment the morning after a David Cameron TV debate where he was expected to wipe the floor with everybody else, and he really didn't. It was the one when Nick Clegg came out on top. This is years and years ago. And the mood on the bus was horrendous, really low, and you could sense the team didn't know what they were going to do. And then my other favourite was Nick Clegg used to have these sneaky cigarettes round the back of not round the back of the battle bus. He would go kind of one bus away, and he didn't think that like 20 journos sussed him out on this. What's been your sort of impression from the buses?
So sadly, Allegra, the buses are much less fun than the David Cameron days. They've changed how much access you really get. So even though Labour publicises its battle bus with Keir Starmer and Angela Rayner, the press is on a separate bus.
That is terrible.
And he tends to travel around in, I know, I'm ruining the magic. He tends to travel around in his Land Rover with his special protection officers. And then we are allowed on the bus for brief moments. So I think I've been on the bus with Keir Starmer for a total of about an hour. Some of that he was behind a little curtain, some of that he came out and chatted to us. But I think Alex has had a bit more of an interesting time.
Have your buses been better?
The Conservative bus is Oxford United football team's former bus, so it's very, I would say, pretty nice quality. It's journalists only, and then you sort of get 10 or 15 minutes if you're lucky with the Prime Minister. Rishi Sunak is very Tiggerish, isn't he? He's very good at sort of geeing himself up for a chat with the media. And my highlights from Tory bus the other day was they took us to a farm with David Cameron, and Rishi Sunak and David Cameron and a farmer were trying to feed some sheep, and as soon as they offered the food, the sheep all ran in the opposite direction extremely quickly, and the Prime Minister sort of sunk to his haunches and just shook his head, and he sort of you almost started to feel a bit sorry for him at that point.
We were joking yesterday that we were trying to find interesting things that Keir Starmer has done on the battle bus, and we were really racking our brains for interesting colour. And we've observed that whenever he gets to a new non-league football ground, he just looks around and says, "Fantastic, fantastic, fantastic."
So he's super disciplined, basically.
Yeah, he comes out for a short visit with some supporters. They all have their placards. He gives the same stump speech, gives one interview to local TV, then he's back, travels for another 2 hours, rinse, repeat, same message, same message. So the bus can get a bit monotonous.
Right, well, look, in this week's episode, we're looking at Labour's foreign policy plans. Given the most likely outcome of the July 4th election is that it is a Labour government, it would be good, wouldn't it, to know what the party has planned for the UK's relationship with Europe, the US and the rest of the world. So, in a word, is it clear what Labour's foreign policy will be?
I think continuity is probably the main thing. They don't want anything against the grain at the moment in Europe, particularly on things like Ukraine.
They have two words for it, a bit grand sounding, progressive realism, which in practice just sort of means that they will pay lip service to their progressive values while being actually quite pragmatic about dealing with some very difficult foreign states like India.
OK, all right. Well, to talk through progressive realism and reality of how some of that will work in practice, we will shortly be turning to Tom Fletcher. He's a former foreign policy advisor to no less than 3 UK prime ministers. He's now principal of Hertford College at Oxford University. Also on the show, we have Ellen Milligan, who's a Bloomberg reporter, hopefully probably familiar to lots of you. And she's just published some brilliant analysis on Keir Starmer and what she believes is his silence when it comes to Brexit. So now we're going to go to our on-the-ground voice for the week, Bloomberg's reporter Ellen Milligan, who you can't see, but she's sitting with a very virtuous... What is it, Ellen? It looks darker than just normal green juice.
It's a green juice mixed with kefir.
And is it your election? Is it your election coping strategy?
It's getting me through the sleep deprivation and lack of vitamin D, yes.
Ellen, you published a piece about Brexit and Starmer. Just talk us through the things that the sources were telling you.
Well, Labour has what it describes as an ambitious plan to forge closer ties with the EU. They describe it as a new geopolitical partnership that they want to build with their closest trading partner. But the truth is that it's actually quite unambitious in the sense that it sets some very clear red lines. Labour will not rejoin the customs union, the single market, or return to freedom of movement, which means it's very limited in what it can do. And essentially all it can do is kind of tinker around the edges of the trading cooperation agreement that was agreed in 2020, rather than fundamentally alter the trading relationship. So it's got a few plans. One is a veterinary agreement, which will ease that border friction, particularly on fresh food and plants. The other is a security pact, which actually the EU had offered Boris Johnson and he rejected it in the negotiation, which is to cooperate on defence, R&D, joint procurement of weaponry, for example, for Ukraine, and then also mutual recognition of professions and visas for musicians. All things that, from my conversations with UK government officials in the Foreign Office, Labour and EU diplomats, are doable, but will involve concessions.
So it feels to me like there's 2 points there. One is that they'll have to do things that they might be criticised for. Do you think they'll be criticised for them, or do you think that actually with a new government and many people saying the opinion polls are becoming more sceptical about Brexit, do you think they will have the kind of political nous to get away with it?
There's, I think, 2 reasons why their ambition on the EU is limited. One is the political reason. They want to win back those, particularly the red wall parts of the country that voted leave in 2016 and they lost in 2019 to the Conservatives, many for the first time, those constituencies. But also it's a genuine desire for their first 5-year term not to be distracted by the same old debates about Brexit which distracted the Conservative government from public services and all these things for several years. I think when it comes to things like concessions, like the ECJ, I don't think they'll have a lot of backlash internally in their Labour Party, especially if they have a big majority. In fact, the Labour base tends to be more pro kind of things like a youth mobility deal that we have reported in here that they actually are open to negotiating, even though they've dismissed it publicly. But I think whether their majority is big or not will depend whether they mind so much about that.
Ellen, there's a really interesting nugget in the piece that you sort of led with when you were promoting it, which is what Labour advisors and senior figures are saying privately about the prospect of rejoining the EU or the kind of the benefit that would have to the economy. Do you want to just spell out actually the thing that they're admitting, which makes everything else that you've just said so extraordinary?
I think the big overarching question for this whole 5-year term that Labour's likely to get is it's so reliant on economic growth, being able to fund everything they want to do pretty much on public services, in particular on defence spending, all these things. They want to get up to that kind of 2% growth that we saw under the Tony Blair era that's been stagnant for the last few years. And what some senior Labour advisors have conceded to me kind of privately is that they know that one of the most impactful ways that they can achieve economic growth is to, for example, rejoin the customs union or the single market. And yet they have given assurances privately and publicly that they will not do that in a first 5-year term. Now, that opens the question as to whether they could come under pressure if they don't achieve the highest growth in the G7 that they've promised, a very ambitious promise, that maybe those red lines will change by the time a next election comes along.
being in those things would have an almost immediate impact on growth, or it would come through in the first term of a parliament. But just extraordinary for them to be conceding it privately and still sticking to their political approach.
I wonder as well, does the size of Labour's majority, if it does win, and if it does win big, do you think that makes a difference on how they would think internally? Obviously, at the moment in the election, Labour doesn't want to say, oh, we could rejoin the single market or the customs union. It doesn't want to give any ground and give any doubt to voters who did vote for Brexit, or at least not in the full sort of Remain camp. Do you think the big majority could shift things, the window of conversation on EU relations further in that direction?
Keir Starmer's shadow cabinet is full of Remainers. I mean, David Lammy described Brexit as a national tragedy in a big speech he did in Parliament after 2020. But this is the thing, and this is what actually Jonathan Reynolds had a very good line, which was that our foreign policy will not be dictated by the internal party politics of the Conservative Party. And so when you say, it rows over the ECJ, quite niche technical things that the voting public mostly don't understand, has been dominating, ECHR, we've seen it over immigration policy recently. Those things aren't going to be so much a problem again if there's a big Labour majority. So I think that's definitely the case. But I do think there is a bit of naivety to think, just because we're kind of a pro-Remain, pro-EU party, we can kind of get all these, the deals done. The EU is incredibly hard to negotiate with. It's very distracted by its own politics and its political shift to the right.
I suppose the thing, listening to you just then, yes, they don't want their foreign policy to be set by the internal wranglings of the Tory party, but it's clear there'll be internal wranglings of the Labour Party, in that if you've got, as Alex says, 200-seat majority, you will have siren voices whispering in your ear saying, you can do it, go for it. You may not have this opportunity again. This is the right thing to do. And we all know you can do the Ming vase strategy ahead of an election. Then people will start to say you don't have to grip onto that Ming vase at all tightly, or even at all. You can not drop it, but to extend the metaphor, you can relax. And I suspect, but I don't know, and I don't think anybody knows, if you have Farage and Reform having done all right in this poll, you will have that will be will be a fairly forceful check, won't it, Alex?
I would have thought so. By the time of the next election, looking sort of 5 years ahead, would he need a political mandate from the public to start making these big changes with the EU? I mean, could he do them sort of in all but name without that political mandate? He's gonna face big sort of pressure from the sort of liberal media and from his own party.
Ellen just wanted to move on, but it's a similar territory, which is immigration. Keir Starmer's got these policies on immigration. He wants to negotiate with France on take-backs, so taking back some of the asylum seekers that come over. How do you think that will work if we have on Sunday the beginning of the national rally doing very well in France's parliament?
This is really interesting because while the would-be Foreign Secretary David Lammy has done a lot of work with the Republicans in the US and has kind of, taken this quite pragmatic approach that they could be in government in 6 months' time, he hasn't done that, and Keir Starmer hasn't done that with the EU. So what I've been told by Labour contacts is that while Keir Starmer and David Lammy have made really good relations with Olaf Scholz, for example, with in Germany, France's Emmanuel Macron. Starmer has not established a relationship with Giorgia Meloni at all, or her team. They've not done work with Marine Le Pen's party in France or the AfD in Germany. Olaf Scholz has an election next year. He looks like he's going to lose it. Macron's going to stay on most likely till 2027, but then you could see a shift. So you could see this position in a Keir Starmer administration where suddenly you're already seeing the political winds shift in the EU, but actually the leadership changes are kind of halfway through or before that, which I think will really change the way that he has relations with them.
I think that they do have big hopes of working quite closely with European centre-right parties on immigration. They have sort of plans that they wouldn't be able to do on their own, basically. And they're already they anticipate that illegal migration is going to be a massive issue. I mean, it's been a huge headache for Rishi Sunak stopping the boats, but I think they think it could get even worse into the first few years of a Labour government. And they keep talking about desperately hoping for the centre-right to win in various elections because they don't think that they can work with far-right parties on immigration. They would just be closed out of that.
But that is what's looking like happening. So
Yes,
what do they do?
My impression is that they're still working. They still have plans that they are hoping Macron will be in place to help them deliver.
That's it for now, but I'm sure we will be returning to this subject in the next few months. Ellen Milligan, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now on to our guest. Tom Fletcher joins us in our London studio. Tom was previously the foreign policy advisor to 3 UK Prime Ministers, Tony Blair, Gordon Brown and David Cameron, and then he became British ambassador to Lebanon. He's currently head of Hertford College, Oxford. Tom, I remember you being, certainly in your role as foreign policy advisor to Gordon Brown, and that crazy trip, was it to Gulf countries and then to Auschwitz within a day?
We did a lot of crazy trips together, I think. And normally I would be the person that had to come back on the plane and basically berate all the press corps for whatever horrible story you'd written about us all. But I think that day, we were coming back out of Afghanistan. We'd had a very grueling trip to Afghanistan, see Karzai. Just got out in time, late at night. Otherwise the plane, the C-130, was going to be grounded in Kabul and we'd all have stayed in Kabul overnight. Got out, I think, via Oman and then on to Auschwitz the next day, and then into big talks with Donald Tusk, who's now back, of course, in Poland. So that was just a normal day in number 10 in those days.
I don't think they do trips. I don't think they do trips cramming quite that much in now.
So Gordon's shuttle diplomacy was lots of shuttle. And I was often there to do the diplomacy. They once mistranslated my job title in China, which was the private secretary for foreign affairs to the Prime Minister. And it got mistranslated as the intimate typist. But even worse, it was the intimate typist for the Prime Minister's affairs overseas, which of course in English means something completely different. But in reality, I didn't organise any Prime Minister's affairs overseas. It was but I was a kind of bag carrier, policymaker, speechwriter, and all the rest. Okay,
so looking at the kind of strategic imperatives for possibly Prime Minister Keir Starmer, what do you think are the 3 things he will be wanting to sort?
I mean, he faces the fullest diary of statecraft of any Prime Minister, I think, for their first month in office since Churchill. That's quite a big claim. But that NATO summit within days of taking office and then that first meeting with Biden, they are enormously consequential for so many of these issues. NATO, Ukraine, for what happens next on the Middle East. And of course, in the background there, you've got the spectre of the orange spectre of Donald Trump waiting in the wings as well. So I think that set of issues is a massive, massive challenge. What next for NATO? What next for UK defence? How are we going to reimagine the threats that actually are coming in our direction and prepare for those? Then I think you've got a really, really tough summer on the Middle East. We may be coming to the end of this phase in Gaza, and it's been a pretty sickening 8-9 months to work through. I have great fears that the war will now move north to my old stomping ground of Lebanon, and that we may see a similar military action there, which would dominate the summer and present some massive challenges to an incoming government. But then, can I have 4? Because Europe is also massive, and I think this redefining, some of that will be about body language and tone of our relationship with Europe, particularly on the security side. And then the danger will be that, look, these first 30 days will be so defining, but the danger will be taking tactical decisions that then influence long-term strategy. And nowhere is that more the case than on China. So you've got to almost work back from the end of this term, maybe the end of 2 terms as Prime Minister, and think, what is the overall tone of that relationship with China? And how do we get the kind of early decisions right to reflect that overall strategy?
As you say, a pretty early decision he's going to have to make is defence spending, and the Conservatives have committed to 2.5 by 2030, and Labour obviously hasn't committed to that yet, and he's got the NATO summit days after coming in. Do you think Labour's position can hold on in terms of 2.5 whenever we can, which is basically their current position, or will they come under pressure from Biden or other allies to really firm up their policy on that?
I think there will be pressure there, but I also think they can hold off. A lot of expectations around that summit will be that they're talking to a grown-up who's going to be there for 8 years. And the body language and the tone will be as important as what they announce. It will be this sense that you have a Prime Minister there who is going to be engaged, who's going to build the relationships, who's going to work on these practical issues. So I think they'll give him some time. There won't be an expectation that everything happens immediately. You know, I mentioned how difficult the calendar is for those 30 days, but that's also an opportunity because you can do a lot of that statecraft, a lot of that relationship building, and try to hold off some of those big long-term strategic decisions. That would be my advice to them.
And he'll be hosting, of course, all the European leaders at Blenheim Palace within a few weeks of becoming Prime Minister as well. How, if you were advising him, how should he approach that sort of initial speed date with all these quick bilaterals with those European leaders?
Well, you made it sound much more fun than it will really be. Speed dating is one way of putting it. It's pretty grueling. I mean, so there's no room for error. And of course, the media, as you know, we used to always talk about on the plane on the way back normally from these visits, the media would be waiting for any sign that, you know, of incompetence or failure or gaffes. The first few months when I worked for David Cameron, the media were just waiting, hanging on his every word for him to get something wrong. And these are kind of complex briefs. And in the midst of it all, you're trying to build that relationship with these other leaders. And so much of that is actually about the theatre of it. And in the midst of that, many of those European leaders are also in a state of flux as well. You know, Macron, Ursula von der Leyen, you know, the Germans. So all of that, it's like a sort of multi-dimensional game of chess. Now, he'll have brilliant people around him who will have prepared those enormous stacks of briefing. But it'll be somebody's job to basically say to him before every meeting, as I used to have to do with Gordon and then with David Cameron, well, you know, here are the three things that you've got to remember in this meeting, the three things to get right. And here are the three things that you're going to be hit by from the other side.
You've painted the opportunities for Starmer, but there are problems and there are sort of limits to his manoeuvrability. Let's just sort of chunk them up. We've heard from Ellen Milligan earlier about restrictions to his ability on Europe and what he might do to make Brexit work better for the UK. What's your analysis of where that ends up?
That will take time and shouldn't be rushed. My advice to them would be to try and get a sort of heavyweight character in there. You know, there are lots of these big figures from previous Labour administrations.
As an ambassador to...
I think they've got a great ambassador on the ground already. I'm not suggesting... I'm not trying to fire one of my ex-colleagues.
Like a sort of
here.
task force
but,
or what?
I mean, having someone who really owns that dossier and is working it 24/7 to work out where the opportunities will be to rebuild that relationship in very practical, tangible ways. I think the low-hanging fruit in all of that is on security and defence, where it's clearly in the interests of the Europeans that we're working more closely together. And I believe, and more importantly, our defence people believe that it's very much in our interests that we align more clearly in response to these threats from Russia inside Europe, from new weapons, from cyber, AI. You know, there are lots and lots of reasons why we need that alignment. And so it feels like that's an early prize for an incoming Labour administration, but also for the Europeans as well.
Tom, do you have someone in mind when you're saying you need someone to really own that brief? Because
not Tom,
definitely not me. I've got my hands full with lots of my amazing students.
We were talking about this earlier. David Miliband, former, of course, Labour Foreign Secretary, now in America, leading a big NGO. He gave a very interesting speech at the Irish Embassy within the past couple of months on the UK's relationship with the EU and the US. It looked like he was sort of making a pitch for David Lammy's job. Or the US ambassador role, but the real focus was on the UK and the EU. Do you think that's something for him?
Oof, I wouldn't know. And we're never very good at using our kind of former big figures in the UK. And it's a cross-party problem, and it's a Whitehall problem as well. We tend to assume that once someone has left office, they're sort of no longer on the bench for us. You've got great people cross-party. David Cameron is one of them, for example. I don't know whether he'll be standing by the phone after the election waiting for a call, but you know, using that expertise and that heft and that those networks that he's built up. David Miliband is obviously a massive heavyweight, knows the UN inside out, knows the Americans, particularly the Democrats, very well.
It'd be very surprising if he didn't have some kind of role, wouldn't it? Sorry, I'm not leading. That's not my observation.
It would seem a waste. It would seem a waste not to have, you know, some of your star strikers on the pitch. I'd add into the mix Cathy Ashton, former EU High Rep, you know, real pro, amazing behind-the-scenes negotiator, massive credibility in Washington and in Europe, and really good networks. Valerie Amos, who ran OCHA at the UN, coordinated humanitarian affairs, you know, another massive heavyweight in the UN system. So you've got all these big names out there. I'm now going to get into trouble with all the people I haven't mentioned. But we should get better. We should be bigger as a government and better at bringing those voices into the conversation.
But one of the problems he will have is whatever the shape of the French Parliament is in the next couple of weeks. What do you think will be the impact of a move to the right in the French Parliament on a Starmer policy platform?
I mean, I think it will make his European interlocutors very jumpy, very edgy. That, they're not talking about the UK election. When you go to Paris or Berlin or Brussels, the conversation is all about France at the moment, and about that wider rightward shift in Europe. It's strange to think after the last, let's say decade or so, where the UK has often resembled this kind of circular firing squad, and everyone's been looking in at us and saying, can you stop exporting problems and start exporting solutions again? It'd be strange to think that at the end of this year, depending on what happens in the States, the Brits could be one of the real grown-ups in the room again, one of the forces of stability and calm in that conversation. But it will definitely influence how much attention those Europeans are able to spend on the practical things, because they will be very jittery.
Let's move on to Gaza and the Middle East. You said at the beginning of the conversation you thought actually the summer could bring things even more to a head, and it might bring in your old stomping ground of Lebanon. Alva and Alex report a lot on the balance within the Labour Party of opinion, wanting Starmer to be tougher on Israel and so on, possible even discussions of an arms embargo. How does that play for Starmer? Is there a clear role for him to lead that in the international community, or will he have to rein that in?
I think all these issues look very different the moment you're on that other side of the black door as well. That moment when you assume the role of Prime Minister and the phone calls start coming in. As David Cameron walked through that door, I pretty much handed him the phone and said, President Obama's on the line and here's what you need to say. So it will feel and look different to the team when they're in there. I think that they clearly have an early decision to make on whether to recognise the state of Palestine. And that will be one way of showing that they can do things slightly different. I think they'll have an early decision on whether to resume funding to UNRWA, the Refugee and Works Agency for the Palestinians, which will certainly be something the Foreign Office and other bits of government will be saying, we've got to get back in there and start to rebuild, start to support civilians. So perhaps those decisions come sooner than decisions on an arms embargo, for example. They've got to basically think about, how do we get the narrative back to the two-state solution? How do we get it back onto the big prize here, which is normalization of relations between Israel and the wider region that includes a Palestinian state? That's the big conversation if you're looking 5-10 years ahead. And so they've got to be careful not to make those sort of tactical misjudgments that might undermine that strategic objective. And then, as I say, this real fear I have that we could, through the summer, be into a different phase of conflict. Israel and Hezbollah are already at war. More Hezbollah fighters have died since October the 7th than in the whole 2006 conflict. More rockets have been fired by Hezbollah on Israeli towns than in that whole conflict. It's not as bad as it can be, and I fear it will get much worse. But that will probably be the big issue that dominates the first summer of Labour foreign policy.
On the arms embargo for Israel, possibly, David Lammy's scrutiny of David Cameron over the last few months has left Labour in a position where they are essentially in favour of stopping arms to Israel in all but name. That everything that they say about why has the government not published legal advice going back months in terms of what Israel's been up to in Gaza. Is it possible for Labour to row back from that position?
When you look at the statements David Lammy has made as Shadow Foreign Secretary, but also look at Keir Starmer's background in international human rights law, it's very difficult for them not to be in a position where they're backing up the rule of law. And so I suspect, and my advice to them would be that they should get in there and see what that legal advice is. And I think at that point, the decisions that they have to take will become very, very clear. I don't know them well enough to know how they take decisions, but I suspect, having observed them from distance, that they're probably quite methodical, quite practical about it, and quite loyally in it all. So I imagine they'll get in there with their own legal advisors and take their view, and that could lead to a different policy outcome in the end. But it depends what's in that advice.
Tom, it's so interesting. From hearing you speak, it's as though you expect David Lammy and the Labour administration to sort of be a bit more muscular and to take a bit more of a lead on those kinds of questions and make up their own minds on it. When I've been speaking to them privately over the past few months, it has felt with a lot of the things on Gaza that they've just been very careful to track what the Americans are doing. So I'm wondering how will those conversations with the US go about the UK potentially wanting to recognise Palestine and those kinds of things? How would that affect the US relationship?
It will be on that first agenda for that first contact with Biden in July, for that first phone call, probably. I imagine Biden would put down a marker on that call that he looks forward to discussing Ukraine, NATO, and the Middle East, and probably China. Those will be the three things I think the Americans will just want to register that level of interest and concern on early on, to signal that when they actually do then sit down and a few days later in Washington, that there'll be that serious pressure from the Americans on all three. Ukraine, NATO is top of that list, actually, above the Middle East. I think the American administration at the moment is trying to exert a lot of pressure on Israel behind the scenes to restrain them from a full-scale invasion of Lebanon, and to try and get them to change the conduct of the war in Gaza. Now, there may be a public line, therefore, with pressure on the UK, not to be more creative and muscular, as you described then. But I wonder whether in private, whether they will be so tough with the UK. Maybe they'll think it's in their interest to have the UK slightly outriding a bit, to remind Israel that it's not as straightforward as they think it is.
Currently, the US administration is one you can see the Starmer team working very comfortably with. If there's a change in November to Trump, we've heard of this David Lammy idea of progressive realism that's going to see them work, we think, very comfortably with Trump. How credible is that?
I think Trump, in his first term, did a huge amount to prove his critics right. He vandalised the alliances on which we rely. He vandalised the institutions like NATO and the UN that are such a key part of UK strategic interests. And of course, he vandalised the values that we share with the Americans, with the Europeans, and with others. And I worry that a Trump 2.0 would be even more erratic, would crash around even more and do even more damage to our interests. Now, let's see. Maybe I'll be proven wrong, but I think most diplomats would share that fear as to what we might face after November if somehow the American people elect him. Now, what does that mean for Prime Minister Starmer and Foreign Secretary Lammy? It will mean that they do have to kind of pull their punches a bit in the next few months, that they do have to hold off in case Trump is elected, because if he is, they'll need to find a way to build a pragmatic relationship. Where can we exert influence? How can we build a relationship where we can actually limit the damage that he will do? And that will mean holding back on some of the temptation to go for strong rhetoric and to think fairly pessimistically about what the minimum we can come out of the next 4 or 5 years with is.
Perhaps the most immediate sort of danger of a Trump presidency is to Ukraine. And, if Trump was to change America's position on Ukraine towards negotiations, towards, ceding territory, do you think Starmer, is he able to counter that? Is he able to lobby Trump against moving America's position? Or is that just a no-hoper stance? Can Britain have its own position, or does it have to follow America's position on Ukraine?
It doesn't have to follow a Trump position on Ukraine, particularly if Trump was basically folding the cards and just saying, here you go, Putin, you win, which is what that would be. It would be a capitulation to Putin. I think this is one of those areas where if progress is made at the European Political Council in July, late July, in plenum, and building up those relationships, in making that a more kind of load-bearing conversation with the Europeans on our security, then you could see a clearer European position in opposition to Trump on that. Now, whether that actually can exercise much influence on him, I'm not sure. We all overestimated the influence that we could have on Trump first time round, sticking him in a gold carriage on the mall and so on. We all like to think that we are so persuasive, and I've seen some prime ministers feel this way as well, that we're such brilliant, influential, persuasive characters that we can bring these hardliners round. There's no evidence from Trump in the first term that suggests that we can do that, just as there hasn't been much evidence that we could do it with Bibi Netanyahu over the last 9 months.
I mean, there's 100 more questions, but I think in terms of time, we probably want to run a lot of that. So that's a great place to leave it for now, Tom. Will you come back and join us in the months ahead when these events are real rather than in prospect? Yeah, I fear we'll be talking about foreign policy a lot over the next 3 months. Tom Fletcher, thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's interesting to hear him be unequivocally concerned about Trump, Alva.
Yeah, striking, isn't it? Because I suppose some people have maybe made their peace with it, or just thinking, even I think privately, lots of Labour people just sort of thinking that that's a bridge they may likely have to cross. And so they're just already thinking about it. It's interesting to just have another voice to spell out again the massive concerns around that.
I thought it was really interesting, him sort of saying there's almost a naivety among European politicians who think they can go over and diplomatically make their case to Trump world. Boris Johnson, we've seen, make the argument to Donald Trump in favour of continued support for Ukraine. It is very unclear whether that has made any difference.
I was trying to imagine it. It's hard just with the personalities to imagine Starmer and Trump gelling, I think. Can you see it?
I think reporters, you guys are going to have a lot of fun at the first Trump-Starmer press conference, where you've got the former director of prosecutions up of the UK alongside someone who's been convicted of 54 crimes.
You could barely imagine two more different people. Everything that Keir Starmer says is about public service and restoring probity in public life and all of this stuff. I think we're pretty clear on how much contempt Keir Starmer had for Boris Johnson. Well, Donald Trump's a different level.
Against all of that, I think the thing I have observed in recent years is that you can have unlikely alliances. They can be more powerful because of it. And if their agendas in any way coalesce or align, then we have seen it.
Yeah, and it is important to say that we don't for certain know what Trump's going to do on things like Ukraine. Optimists in the West clearly see a world where Trump thinks there's political opportunity for him to continue to support Ukraine militarily and to show America as stronger and show progress in the way that Biden has been unable to on the battlefield. So it's not a complete no-hoper, but certainly difficult.
I also thought that one of Tom's first comments that we need to get him back on to discuss in more detail maybe is saying about how Labour needs to work backwards in terms of where it wants its relationship with China to be at the end of one parliament or two parliaments. That's clearly the sort of big strategic difficulty. There are lots of sort of industrial and geopolitical questions that Labour's going to have to tackle that everyone's already talking about privately. So I think that's going to be really interesting.
Until we see you next, thank you very much, Alva Ray and Alex Wickham. Thanks for listening to this week's Voternomics from Bloomberg. This episode was hosted by me, Allegra Stratton, with Alex Wickham and Alva Ray. It was produced by Summer Sardi with booking support from Chris Martley. Production support and sound design by Moses Andam. Brendan Francis Newnham is our executive producer. Sage Bauman is head of podcasts, and special thanks to Tom Fletcher and Ellen Milligan. Please subscribe, rate and review wherever you listen to podcasts.